Have you ever really stopped to think about how a country actually runs? I mean, who pays for the roads, the schools, the military? It all boils down to one incredibly important document, the government budget. So today, we're going to pull back the curtain and break down this financial game plan for an entire nation. Let's just imagine for a second that a country has one gigantic wallet. There's money coming in and there's money going out. But where does a nation actually get its cash from? And what on earth does it spend it all on? That's the big question we're diving into.
So what is a government budget, officially speaking? Well, it's an annual financial statement. It's basically a super detailed plan of all the money the government expects to get, that's the revenue, and all the money it's planning to spend, the expenditure, all within one financial year.
But here's the thing. A budget is so much more than just a spreadsheet of numbers. It's actually a super powerful tool that shows you what a country really cares about, what its priorities are, and it has some seriously big goals. Through the budget, a government can really steer the entire economy. It can move resources around to help people out, for social welfare. It can try to shrink the gap between the rich and the poor, and it can kickstart economic growth. It's also used to make sure one part of the country doesn't get left behind and to keep important public companies running.
And this quote really hits the nail on the head. It gets to the very heart of it all. See, private companies are all about making a profit, right? But the government budget is supposed to be the great balancer. It steps in to make sure money is also spent on things that benefit everyone, like hospitals and clean water, not just things that make money. Okay, so to pull off all of these massive goals, a government needs money. A lot of money. So let's follow the money trail and figure out where a nation's income actually comes from. So the whole budget is pretty much split into two main parts. First, you've got the revenue budget. Think of this as the account for all the day-to-day regular income and spending. Then you have the capital budget, which is all about the big long-term stuff, investments and major debts. Now, to understand the money coming in, here's a super simple test. If the money coming in doesn't create a future debt and doesn't come from selling off something the government owns, it's a revenue receipt. Think of it like your regular salary. But if it does create a debt, like taking out a loan, or it comes from selling an asset, well, that's a capital receipt. Of course, the biggest chunk of government revenue comes from taxes, and they really fall into two main buckets. You've got direct tax, like the income tax that comes out of your paycheck. The government taxes you, and you pay it. You can't pass that burden on. Then there's indirect tax, like GST. A company pays it to the government, but then they just shift the burden over to you by adding it to the price of whatever you're buying. But hey, taxes aren't the only game in town. Governments also make money from profits they get from public companies, from fees for things like passports or licenses, from fines when people break the law, and even from grants given by other countries. Okay, so we've seen how the nation's wallet gets filled up. Now let's flip the coin and look at the other side. Where does all that money actually get spent? And just like with income, government spending is split into two types. Revenue expenditure is all about the day-to-day running costs, things that don't create a lasting asset, like paying salaries. Capital expenditure, on the other hand, is all about investing. It's spending that either builds a new national asset or pays off a big long-term debt. This is the perfect way to lock it in your brain. Paying the monthly salaries for all government employees, that's a regular operational cost, revenue expenditure. But spending a ton of money to build a massive new dam that's going to last for 50 years, that is an investment in the country's future, a classic capital expenditure. And now, we've arrived at the part of the budget that always makes the headlines, the deficit. This is where we figure out if the country is living within its means. You can think of it as a financial health check for the whole nation.
So what is a budget deficit? Simply put, it's when you spend more money than you make. The government is planning to spend more than it expects to bring in. But, and this is important, not all deficits are the same.
To really understand what's going on, economists look at three different types of deficits. Each one tells us a slightly different story about the country's financial situation. So let's quickly break them down. First up is the revenue deficit. This one's pretty straightforward. It just compares the day-to-day spending with the day-to-day income. It answers a simple question. Is the government's regular income enough to cover its regular bills? A revenue deficit is a real warning sign. It means the government is borrowing money just to keep the lights on and pay its staff, not to build anything new. It's kind of like using a credit card to buy your weekly groceries. It's not sustainable, and it just digs a deeper hole of debt for the future. Next, we have the big one, the fiscal deficit.
this is the number you hear about the most. It takes all government spending and subtracts all government income except for any money it borrowed. What you're left with is the grand total of how much money the government has to borrow that year just to make everything work.
So yeah, the fiscal deficit basically tells you how much new debt the country is taking on that year. A really high fiscal deficit can lead to a very dangerous situation called a debt trap. That's where a country has to take out new loans just to pay the interest on its old loans. It's a vicious cycle that can really damage an economy.
Okay, our final health check is the primary deficit. To get this number, you take that big fiscal deficit we just talked about, the total borrowing number, and you subtract the interest payments that the government has to make on all of its old loans from past years. So why is this number so useful? Well, the primary deficit shows us exactly how much the current government's policies are adding to the debt, completely separate from the baggage of old interest payments. If the primary deficit is zero, it's actually a huge deal. It means that all the new borrowing is just to service old debt, and you finally stopped digging the hole any deeper. So, as we wrap this up, I want to leave you with this thought. A deficit isn't just some abstract number on a government report. It's the gap between what a country spends and what it earns. And that gap forces us to ask a really fundamental question. What does it say about our priorities right now? And what kind of financial future are we actually building for the next generation?